These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. On March 27, 1963 in Gloucester, an aircraft slammed into a house so precisely that its tail still towers above the roofline in this photo. Both pilots did not survive the impact. Victorian England, around 1880. Child chimney sweeps were hired because they could crawl inside narrow flues, breathing heavy soot for hours. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 required sweeps to be registered and helped end the use of climbing boys. German East Africa, First World War. This photo is commonly captioned as a boy marching inside an elephant foot costume to hide a column's footprints in soft ground. The trick is often linked to Commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, but the specific story is not fully documented. Grand Palais, Paris, 1916. Wounded French soldiers practiced marching drills indoors during the First World War as part of rehabilitation and readiness training. The huge glass roof hall was converted into a military hospital and training space during the war. Chinese Eastern Railway, around 1900. Russian security guard officers pose with detained Manchurian Honghuzi, a label often used for bandit groups in the region. The railway was a strategic corridor through Manchuria. Seoul, September 24, 1992. South Korean preacher Lee Jang-rim was arrested after a failed end of the world prediction that triggered panic and financial losses among followers. The case became a national warning about how fast fear-based claims can spread and turn into fraud. Kenya, November 1952. People accused of links to the Mau Mau movement are held behind barbed wire during the colonial state of emergency. Britain built a large detention system to control the uprising. Githunguri, Central Kenya, April 1953. People accused in the Mau Mau cases were marched to court wearing large number tags instead of being called by name. The numbers let colonial courts process mass cases fast. West Berlin, August 16, 1961. About 300,000 people gathered at Schöneberg City Hall to protest the new Berlin Wall and demand a stronger response from the Western Allies. Their banner warned, "You do not stop tanks with paper." Iran-Iraq War, 1981. An Iraqi soldier pauses to kiss his child before leaving for deployment. The image became a famous reminder that this conflict pulled ordinary families into sudden goodbyes. Danzig, May 28, 1933. Police detain a street demonstrator on Election Day as a crowd watches. The German majority port city, now Gdansk, was already sliding toward one-party rule in 1933. Poznań, Poland, 1938. Polish poet Irina Bobowska, disabled since childhood, is photographed in a wheelchair years before the war. She later joined the Polish resistance, was arrested under German occupation, and did not survive in 1942. Warsaw, 1943. German occupation troops questioned Jewish civilians after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which lasted from April 19th to May 16th. It began when authorities entered the sealed district to remove the remaining residents. Honolulu, Hawaii, 1900. Smoke towers over Chinatown after a controlled burn meant to stop a disease outbreak spread out of control. The fire destroyed much of the district and displaced thousands of residents. France, 1917. A French messenger dog in a protective mask sprints through thick battlefield smoke during the First World War. Dogs carried dispatches between trench positions and often arrived faster than human runners because they moved low and used cover. May 1945. British troops burned the last wooden barracks at Bergen-Belsen after evacuating survivors. The fires were used to reduce lice and slow a typhus outbreak while the site was dismantled. Berlin, 1948. A massive flak-term air defense tower is being demolished, and the blast shows how thick its reinforced concrete walls were. These towers were so hard to break that post-war crews often had to use repeated charges and then clear the rubble for months. On January 22, 1987, Pennsylvania Treasurer R. Bud Dwyer opens an envelope during a televised press conference in Harrisburg. What followed on air became one of the most infamous moments in American television history. December 31st, 1938. Adolf Hitler is seen at a private New Year's Eve gathering playing Kegeln, a traditional German form of bowling, with Eva Braun nearby. The eerie detail is how ordinary party decorations and games sit next to the decisions that would soon reshape Europe. Ham the chimpanzee is strapped into his couch for Mercury Redstone 2, launched on January 31, 1961, to test the capsule and life support on a suborbital flight. He completed simple button tasks during the trip and was recovered alive after splashdown. This is the One Log House, a tourist cabin carved from a single giant redwood log and hauled by truck in Northern California in the 1940s. The log was hollowed into a usable interior with rooms, turning one tree into a roadside attraction near Garberville. Berlin, 1935. Adolf Hitler attends a memorial service for Polish leader Józef Piłsudski, a rare public appearance for him inside a church setting. It was a diplomatic signal after the Germany-Poland Non-Aggression Pact of 1934. Serra Pelada, Pará, Brazil, 1984. Thousands of miners climbed the open pit by hand, hauling sacks of earth up steep mud ladders in a human river. At its peak, the rush drew tens of thousands of workers, making it one of the largest manual gold mines ever photographed. January 24, 1944. The B-17, Hang the Expense 3, limped back to England with its tail torn open after anti-aircraft fire near Ostend during an aborted Frankfurt mission. Tail gunner Roy Urich was thrown clear and survived, but was captured. Washington, District of Columbia, December 28, 1925. Firefighters spray water onto the George J. Mueller Candy Company on Pennsylvania Avenue as smoke fills the street and hoses snake across the pavement. Paris, 1940 to 1944. Many private cars were seized by German occupation authorities and fuel was tightly rationed, so people relied on bicycles and walking. This field of parked cars shows how quickly a modern city can lose mobility when transport and fuel are controlled. Paris, 1917. Rows of Farman aircraft are assembled inside a giant factory hall, showing early mass production for the First World War. The Farman brothers ran the company from 1908 to 1936, building aircraft. Brooklyn, 1927. A roadside safety board publicly counts serious injuries and traffic fatalities, then asks drivers, "Slow up," and "What's your hurry?" This was an early data-driven road safety campaign using real-time numbers to shame speeding and change behavior. 1945. Dragon's Teeth. Concrete tank obstacles on the Siegfried Line form a jagged wall meant to slow armor and funnel vehicles into kill zones. Allied troops often bypassed or breached these fields with engineers, explosives, and bulldozers instead of attacking straight through. Paris, 1953. A painter balances inside the Eiffel Tower's iron lattice while applying a fresh protective coat high above the city. The tower is repainted about every 7 years to prevent rust, using tens of tons of paint each cycle. New York, around 1900. An immigrant family lines up for the camera in plain work clothes, showing how many newcomers arrived with little more than what they could carry. In this era, most immigrants entered through Ellis Island, where inspectors quickly checked names, health. Near Pozières, September 1916. British soldiers haul a heavy howitzer along a mud road on the Somme front, where wheels sank and every meter cost sweat. Moving big guns often required teams of men, horses, or tractors, and the mud could delay artillery for days. March 31, 1918. South African soldiers pose with Corporal Jackie, a baboon mascot dressed in uniform and holding a rifle for the camera. Jackie reportedly followed his unit, learned basic drills, and became one of the strangest official mascots of the First World War. Tsingtao, 1914. German defenders disguised an artillery position with painted dummy heads to confuse enemy spotters during the siege. Early camouflage like this relied on simple shapes and false targets because aerial and long-range observation was rapidly improving. Japan, 1945. This car runs on a charcoal gasifier, with the generator mounted on the rear to turn wood fuel into combustible gas for the engine. Such conversions spread during fuel shortages, but they cut power and required constant refueling and cleaning of tar and ash. Cuba, 1958. Brothers Fidel and Raúl Castro are photographed during the Cuban Revolution with a shoulder-fired launcher used for anti-vehicle fire. The uprising ended in January 1959 when Fulgencio Batista fled and the rebels entered Havana. Sahara, 1955. A group huddles in the tiny shade of a lone palm, showing how precious a few degrees of relief can be in open sand. In desert travel, shade and timing matter so much that long treks often start before sunrise and pause at midday. Dubai, 1991. The main road cuts through wide, empty lots with only a few high rises, showing how recent the skyline really is. Much of Dubai's modern boom accelerated in the 1990s and 2000s as new districts, ports. United States, 1952. A delivery truck drops into a sudden sinkhole that opened in the pavement, leaving the vehicle wedged nose down. Sinkholes can form when water washes out soil under roads, so the surface looks solid, right until it collapses. May 13, 1950. The first official Formula One World Championship race was held at Silverstone in England, launching the series that still defines top-level motorsport. Giuseppe Farina won in an Alfa Romeo and later became the first Formula One world champion. United States, 1887. Mormon polygamists pose in striped jail uniforms after the Edmunds-Tucker Act tightened federal punishment for plural marriage and seized church assets. The pressure helped push the 1990 Manifesto. Bogside, Londonderry, Northern Ireland, 1971. Don McCullen captured a street confrontation as a young man throws a brick while officers shelter behind shields. The Bogside became a symbol of the era's unrest, with barricaded streets. Bethlehem Steel, 1915. Workers stand on a massive armored turret shell built for the battleship USS Pennsylvania, showing how a single gun housing could be the size of a small building. These turrets were designed to protect the guns and crew with thick steel while the ship fired heavy shells at long range. Israel, 1969. A military police officer measures a servicewoman's skirt length as part of uniform regulations and discipline checks. The photo shows how even small details of appearance were enforced by rules, not personal choice. Great Mississippi River Flood, 1993. Downtown Madison, Wisconsin, near the state capitol, is surrounded by high water as rivers overflowed across the Midwest. It became one of the costliest United States floods of the 20th century and forced weeks of closures and evacuations along the river system. July 1939. Oklahoma City. A family lives in a makeshift canvas and lumber shelter inside a public camp during the Great Depression. Camps like these, often called Hoovervilles, spread near cities as jobs vanished, and government photographers documented them to guide relief efforts. London, 1940. 19-year-old Airdrie Davis from Clapton lifts a cat from an air raid-damaged building, using a looped rope as a simple rescue tool. Contemporary reports credit her with saving about 600 stray cats during wartime London. France, 1907. Paul Cornu's experimental helicopter used two large counter-rotating rotors on a lightweight bicycle-style frame. It achieved a brief manned hop only about 1 to 2 feet high, making it one of the first piloted helicopter liftoffs on record. Yellowstone, 1870. A U.S. Geological Survey worker stands beside Old Faithful, showing the scale of the eruption plume. Old Faithful became famous because its eruptions are unusually regular, making it one of the park's most predictable geysers. Africa, First World War. A British soldier poses with a horse painted in zebra stripes, an early camouflage idea meant to break up the animal's outline at distance. Stripes were tested because they can confuse shape and movement, long before modern patterned uniforms became standard. 1952. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera review art for Tom and Jerry's The Two Mouseketeers, which won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short. Tom and Jerry shorts won 7 Academy Awards in total, making them one of the most awarded series in animation history. London, 1960s. Regent Street is strung with giant angel decorations for the holiday shopping season above the traffic. These large street displays became a signature of West End retail, designed to draw crowds and keep the lights on late into the evening. On board HMS Prince of Wales, Winston Churchill bends down to greet the ship's mascot cat, often identified as Blackie, while sailors watch. The famous photo was taken during the August 1941 Atlantic meeting with Franklin D. Roosevelt, when the Atlantic Charter was announced. London, December 1952. A police officer uses a flare to guide traffic during the Great Smog, when visibility dropped to just a few meters. The crisis pushed the Clean Air Act of 1956, which restricted coal smoke and changed city air for decades. Second World War. A republic. P-47. Thunderbolt returns with its propeller badly damaged, yet the airframe and big radial engine often kept running long enough to get pilots home. Its rugged design and heavy armor made it one of the toughest fighter bombers of the war. Kara Sea, January 1986. The cargo ship Rosia sits locked in sea ice as spotlights cut through Arctic darkness. Ships in this region often needed icebreaker escort because pressure ridges can trap a hull for days. First World War, 1918. A soldier fits gas masks onto cavalry horses, complete with a filter canister. Armies issued animal masks because horses and mules moved guns and supplies, so losing them could stall an entire front line. Soviet Union, 1951. Space dogs Mishka and Chizh pose in early flight gear with breathing tubes as researchers prepared animals for high-altitude rocket tests. These experiments measured how living bodies handled acceleration and low pressure years before the first human spaceflight. United Kingdom, 1945. Neighbors pack a narrow street for Victory in Europe Day, waving flags as the war in Europe ended. Many communities held improvised parties with shared food, music, and tables dragged straight into the road. Grand Prix Racing, 1948. An open-wheel car slides through a corner as the driver counter-steers, long before the Formula One World Championship began in 1950. Cars of this era had narrow tires, drum brakes, and no seatbelts, so control depended on pure skill and nerve. 1950. Elizabeth Taylor relaxes in her ocean liner cabin while crossing the Atlantic, back when celebrity travel meant days at sea instead of hours in the air. Luxury liners offered private suites, dining rooms, and photo calls on board. Genoa, 1911. The Italian battleship Conte di Cavour takes shape on the slipway, with its turret openings and deck layout already visible before launch. It later served through major rebuilds, showing how early dreadnoughts were updated for a new era of naval warfare. Carmel, 1939. Workers harvest grapes by hand at a vineyard, the first step before crushing, fermenting, and aging wine. Before modern machines, picking teams moved row by row with baskets, and speed mattered because grapes start fermenting soon after harvest. Tibidabo, Barcelona, 1915. Passengers ride an air railway suspended between steel towers high above the hillside, an early cable transport attraction. The tiny open platform shows how little safety gear existed on many rides before modern standards. 1947. McConnell School trainees practice in-flight service on a mock cabin, learning how to assist motion-sick passengers with calm, step-by-step routines. Early flight attendant training focused on etiquette and safety because cabins were louder, bumpier. Yosemite around 1870. A wagon drives through a man-cut tunnel in a giant sequoia, a showpiece made to prove these trees were wider than a road. Many tunnel trees were later lost to storms and decay because cutting the opening weakened the trunk. Paris, late 1980s. Engineers mark out the Louvre pyramid footprint with cables and poles in the Cour Napoleon before the glass structure rose. Designed by I.M. Pei, the pyramid opened in 1989 and became the museum's main entrance. Los Angeles, June 17, 1994. A white Ford Bronco drives slowly on the freeway while police cars escort it in the televised O.J. Simpson chase. An estimated 95 million people watched live, making it one of the biggest real-time TV events of the 1990s. 1980. Freddie Mercury performs live with Queen, using his trademark half-microphone stand after the original broke early in the band's career. That broken stand became part of his stage style, letting him move like a dancer while still singing full power. Atlantic City, around 1920. A long line of swimsuit contestants marches on the boardwalk as a cameraman films, showing how beauty pageants were already built for mass media. Events like this helped turn Atlantic City into a national summer stage. Peru, 1962. Fidel Castro is photographed donating blood after a major earthquake in a public drive to support people affected. The image was widely used as a political message that framed aid as a national duty, not just a private act. Tehran Conference, 1943. Winston Churchill steps out wearing a Karakul hat reportedly given by Joseph Stalin for Churchill's 69th birthday. The Big Three meeting in Tehran set key plans for the Western Allied invasion of France. Kobe, Japan, January 17, 1995. A section of the Hanshin Expressway buckled and fell after the Great Hanshin earthquake, leaving lanes twisted like paper. The quake exposed how older elevated road columns needed stronger seismic design, accelerating major retrofits across Japan. Saint-Mihiel Sector, France, 1919. This aerial photo shows Combres Hill cut into crater fields and trench lines that look like a lunar surface. Air reconnaissance made maps from images like this, turning battlefield scars into precise grids for artillery and planning. Oradour-sur-Glane, France. The ruins were left standing after a Second World War atrocity, and Charles de Gaulle ordered the village not to be rebuilt. The rusted cars and empty streets became a permanent open-air memorial, preserved exactly as the day everything stopped. Second World War era. A Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft collides on an airfield with a service truck based on the Gaz-AA, crushing the vehicle's body with the aircraft's nose. The photo shows how crowded wartime airfields were, where a single handling mistake could sideline valuable equipment instantly. Berlin, 1991. A giant Lenin head is strapped to a flatbed as the monument is removed during the post-Cold War wave of renaming and rebuilding. Many such statues were taken down, stored, or cut up as cities rewrote public space after the fall of the Eastern Bloc. Poland, January 21, 1945. Soviet soldiers greet newly freed prisoners at Auschwitz as the camp was taken by the Red Army during the Vistula-Oder offensive. The liberation revealed the scale of the camp system and became one of the clearest. Serra Pelada, Pará, Brazil, 1986. Tens of thousands of miners hauled heavy sacks up mud ladders by hand in one of the largest gold rush pits ever filmed. The whole mine worked like an ant colony, with human chains replacing machines because the slopes were too unstable for vehicles. Korean War, 1951. A pilot brought his P-51 Mustang back to base with the fuselage torn open, showing how tough the airframe could be even after severe damage. The Mustang, designed for the Second World War. London, around 1930. A market porter carries a towering stack of baskets on his head, using balance and neck strength instead of carts in narrow lanes. Porters like this were paid by the load, so speed and carrying capacity directly meant more money. Termez, Uzbekistan, February 15, 1989. A mother holds up a sign searching for her son as Soviet troops withdraw from Afghanistan across the Friendship Bridge. That day marked the official end of the Soviet military presence after nearly 10 years of war. Soviet Union, 1971. Pranas Brzezinskas and his son Algirdas became the first people to divert a Soviet passenger plane abroad, forcing it to land in Turkey. During the takeover, a flight attendant did not survive, and several others were injured, and Turkish courts later sentenced Pranas to 8 years. Germany, 1910s. A boxing bout draws a huge ring of spectators inside a camp courtyard, showing how organized sport was used to fill long days and boost morale. Matches like this were often staged with makeshift ropes, simple gloves. Stalingrad, February 1943. A Soviet soldier shares tobacco with captured German soldiers after the battle ended. The photo shows the moment after the surrender, when survival and basic supplies mattered more than uniforms. Washington, District of Columbia, January 28, 1922. The Knickerbocker Theater is seen after its roof failed under heavy snow, leaving the auditorium ripped open. The incident pushed tougher building inspections and better snow load standards for large roofs in the city. Russia, 1906. Tsar Nicholas II addresses deputies of the new State Duma, created after the 1905 revolution to limit absolute rule. The Duma's powers were restricted by the fundamental laws of 1906, setting up years of conflict between Parliament and the Crown. 1921. Officials catalog confiscated church mitres, the jeweled ceremonial headwear of Orthodox bishops. The mass seizures of religious valuables during the early Soviet period were tied to state policy and the famine relief campaign. Baltimore, Maryland, 1909. Child workers sit and sort goods inside a packing factory, captured during the era when kids were widely used for low-paid industrial labor. Photos like this fueled reform campaigns that later tightened child labor limits. Colombo, Sri Lanka, July 30th, 1987. During an official ceremony, an honor guard soldier swung his rifle toward Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and security moved in immediately. The incident was caught on camera and became a diplomatic shock. Beuthen, Upper Silesia, Germany, 1943. Soviet laborers under German control lie on the yard during a break at a mining and industrial site. Many such workers were transported across occupied Europe to keep factories running. New York State, August 5, 1957. This is Eleanor Roosevelt's pistol carry permit from Dutchess County, issued while she lived in Hyde Park. The card lists her as a writer and lecturer and notes the permit was not valid in New York City. Pittsburgh, 1909. Publicity photos show baby John Wilson Webb, advertised as 3.5 months old and 120 pounds, posed beside his mother. In that era, newspapers and traveling shows often used dramatic captions like this to pull crowds. London, 1940. Inside St. Paul's Cathedral, after an air raid, the roof is torn open and debris covers the floor below the altar. Photos like this became symbols of the Blitz, showing how landmarks could be hit yet still remain standing. Berlin, 1989. Crowds climb the wall near Checkpoint Charlie on Friedrichstrasse, turning a guarded border into a street-level celebration. The opening of crossings after November 9th triggered the fast collapse of the barrier that had split the city since 1961. Philippines, 1870s. A wealthy family poses at a large Bahay Nabato home with a stone base and an upper wooden level designed for airflow in tropical heat. The steep thatched roof and wide windows show how status and climate shaped architecture. Moscow, 1926. Joseph Stalin is seen among the pallbearers carrying the casket of Felix Dzerzhinsky during the state funeral procession. Dzerzhinsky founded the Cheka and later led the OGPU, making his farewell a major. Hopi girl Modisi, photographed in 1879, wears the traditional squash blossom hairstyle that signaled an unmarried young woman. George Lucas later cited this native hairstyle as a key inspiration for Princess Leia's iconic buns. Stalingrad, 1942. Soviet soldiers climbed the bare steel grid of a ruined factory roof, using the beams as a route and lookout. The city's giant plants became a maze of shattered workshops where every corridor and floor could decide control of the block. In England in 1916, museum workers and archaeologists used ropes and a hoist to rebuild a dinosaur leg taller than a man, turning scattered fossils into one giant limb. This photo shows early fossil work was part engineering and part detective work. In 1972, East Berlin guards climbed ladders to add extra wire fencing along the top of the Berlin Wall, making the barrier harder to cross and easier to watch. Below them, people on the street could only look up as the skyline changed in real time. A silent upgrade. Ballet star Serge Lefar poses with a pair of maple dueling pistols by the French firm Lepage, a 12mm set that became a real legend in Russian culture. One of them is linked to the famous duel of poet Alexander Pushkin. In 1957, Italian film star Gina Lollobrigida strolls past English workers, and the contrast between her tailored dress and their work clothes turns the sidewalk into a movie scene. Their frozen looks capture a real moment of celebrity culture before social media. In 1941, writers and field reporters Mikhail Sholokhov, Yevgeny Petrov, and Alexander Fadeev examined instruments taken from a disabled German armored vehicle, photographed by Georgy Petrusov. The dials and wiring are real navigation and communication tech from that time. In England in 1931, a woman tests an experimental monowheel where the driver sits inside a giant rolling ring like a human gyroscope. The wild part is that turning and braking had to fight the wheel's own momentum, so one wrong move could make the whole machine try to spin around its rider. The Titanic main dining saloon was built like a top London restaurant, with carved wood panels, bright ceiling lights, and rows of tables meant to serve hundreds in one sitting. This calm, empty room feels almost unreal because it shows how much luxury was packed into a ship that promised a new era of travel. On February 10, 1954 in Virginia, Private Jiggs, the Marine Corps mascot, sits in a classroom like a real recruit, complete with a notebook and a front row seat. The Marines have used bulldogs as living symbols of toughness for decades. In December 1936, on Gray's Inn Road in London, a tram driver stopped his car to hand an apple to an elephant standing on the tracks like it owned the street. The route sign to Wandsworth makes it even more surreal, because for one moment, city transport and a traveling animal. Around 1930, a circus visited a children's hospital, and clown Charlie Smith posed beside a nurse, two small kids, and a tiny pony. The face paint and huge costume feel strangely serious in this calm room, showing how older entertainment tried to lift spirits with bold disguise that could also unsettle. This woman became famous for cheering up American soldiers, with stories saying she kissed as many as 10,000 men in uniform during the 1940s. The photo captures how a simple, human gesture could spread confidence through an entire unit faster than any speech. Belfast, 1973. A security patrol moves along Little Patrick Street, with the street sign hanging above the corner wall. The small boy right beside them shows how everyday life kept going in a city where stress could change from one corner to the next. In March 1942 at Pearl Harbor, sailors unload submarine trout after it carried about 20 tons of gold and silver bars as ballast from Corregidor, taken from 12 Philippine banks. The cargo was moved to keep it out of foreign hands, and trout was later lost at sea in February 1944. In Florida in 1971, the Apollo 14 crew trained in full spacesuits, practicing how to collect soil samples and handle tools with stiff gloves. The funniest detail is the small armadillo in the foreground, a perfect reminder that even the most serious moon rehearsal still happens on a living planet. Paris, May, 1968. Police climb over makeshift street barricades in the Latin Quarter during the student-led protests that pushed France into a nationwide strike. The sign for the Royal Luxembourg Bar freezes the scene in place. This is the German Maus Super Heavy prototype being shipped to Kubinka, and the turret and hull came from different test builds, so the camouflage pattern does not match. Look closely at the odd hammer and sickle mark because it hints at a rushed capture. This courtroom photo shows Bruce Davis during a late 1960s cult case that drew worldwide attention, with other members seated behind him. The calm faces and cramped benches show how a few hours in court can decide the story the public remembers for decades. In Graz, Austria, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, local residents watch the ceremonial hall at the Jewish cemetery as it is set on fire during Kristallnacht. This image shows how public intimidation worked in plain sight, turning a neighborhood crowd into part of a turning point in European history. This 1933 service dog identity card gave a working dog and its handler official permission to ride the city tram, with tickets bought for both. The printed rules even required a muzzle inside the carriage, proving city transport had strict paperwork for dogs nearly a century ago. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson spoke to Congress just 2 months after the 16th Amendment cleared the way for a federal income tax in the United States. The first version was aimed mostly at the highest earners, hitting about the top 1% with a top rate of around 6%. New York, January 1st, 1942. Partygoers sleep wherever they can after New Year celebrations, coats still on and shoes kicked off. The scattered hats and paper on the floor make it feel like the city hit pause for a few hours before the next day started. On June 6, 1944, Canadian soldiers sit packed into a landing craft as it heads toward Juno Beach in Normandy, one of 5 main landing areas in the Allied operation. Each man is carrying heavy gear in a tiny moving space. In November 1918, a Belgian girl feeds a Canadian artillery horse from a bucket, turning a work animal into a gentle friend for a moment. These horses hauled guns and supplies across muddy roads, so this simple snack was also a thank you to the quiet power that kept whole units moving. Around 1917 at the Pratt Institute, men sit in a cooking class with Miss Hanks and Miss Kierstead, training to become Army cooks. The lesson was practical logistics, because feeding a unit well could decide how long it stayed effective far from home. On January 12, 1917, near Cambrai, a British Army work party hauls duckboards through a support trench at night, turning heavy planks into a silent lifeline over mud and water. Those boards kept boots off the flooded floor and helped prevent trench foot. In the 1940s at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, this billboard warned workers to keep quiet, a public reminder that the town was built for a top-secret wartime project. The message uses simple rules and cartoon faces to show how an entire city could exist in plain sight while almost nothing about its real purpose was allowed to leave. In Normandy in 1944, a French dairymaid leads her cows through a meadow scattered with 1,000-pound Royal Air Force airdropped casings waiting to be cleared. The surreal contrast shows how quickly farmland turned into a temporary storage ground. In London around 1917, women window cleaners balance on tall ladders and stool steps, turning a risky street job into a normal workday. With many men away at war, these crews kept shops and offices running. In 1957 on Madison Avenue, a window cleaner hangs outside a high-rise with only a belt and rope while traffic moves far below. Before modern safety harness systems, crews relied on rope seats and knots, and this single moment shows the hidden job that kept Manhattan's glass shining. In 1960 in Galesburg, Michigan, Brad Curry walks to his school bus while his pet fawn stands on the path like a loyal guardian. The long shadows and the quiet animal make the morning feel unreal, as if the fawn is trying to memorize the routine before he disappears down the road. This 1915 team rides an extra-long, multi-rider tandem bicycle, where every pedal set is linked so the whole frame moves only when the group stays perfectly in sync. One mistimed push can wobble the line and waste everyone's power, which is why this looks funny. Buddy Ebsen was the first actor cast as the Tin Man for The Wizard of Oz in 1939, and he recorded the songs and began filming. He had to leave after the aluminum powder makeup triggered a serious breathing reaction. A frame from a 1901 film is often cited as the earliest recorded two-finger V gesture aimed straight at the camera. Long before it was linked with victory or peace, in Britain, this sign could mean a rude insult when the palm faced inward. Mogadishu, 1968. Two Somali women pose at a bar in sleek modern dresses, capturing a city that looked like a confident coastal capital. In the years after independence in 1960, Mogadishu's nightlife and popular music boomed. At 5 o'clock in the morning on May 14, 1871, the Great Battery at Port Maillot is lined with cannons as crews work in the gray dawn near Paris. Across the horizon, the Mont Valérien fortress dominated the western approach. In 1959, Dagmar the Washington Basset Hound rings in New Year's Eve dressed like a tiny party guest, framed by a starburst clock and noisemakers. The sleepy face says it all. Humans chase midnight, but the dog is already done with the whole idea. In 1944, South African volunteer soldiers celebrate Christmas in the Italian mountains, huddled inside a rough shelter while they sip local wine. The torn blankets and cramped space show how holidays on campaign were built from whatever could be found. Taken in 1873 at Owenga on Rikohu, this photo shows Moriori people wearing a striking mix of traditional items and European clothing, with some men carrying staffs. The albatross tufts placed in their beards are a rare detail caught on camera. In the 1950s, Bévier and Southern Locomotive 110 rolls into the rail yard at Bévier, Missouri, surrounded by stacks of spare steel wheel sets waiting their turn. The slogan on the tender, "Have train will haul," captures the rough pride of small railroad lines that kept mines. In 1944, the B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Hell's Angels, posed with its crew after completing 48 missions, a huge number for one aircraft and one team. Records say 25 of those flights ended with no injuries and no turnbacks. Napier area, November 1865. Pai Marire, followers known as How How, sit on the ground while colonial forces stand behind them, creating a sharp power contrast in one frame. The mix of Maori and European clothing makes this a rare visual record of a fast-changing era, when faith, identity. On May 7, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson visits Appalachia on a poverty tour, crouching close and shaking hands on a worn porch. This stop helped shape the public push for the war on poverty because the photos made living conditions impossible to ignore. In 1961, Salvador Allende stands beside Che Guevara at an Organization of American States conference, a rare moment when two future icons shared the same room. One would later lead Chile through democratic politics, while the other became a global symbol of revolution. In 1954, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, exhausted French soldiers file out in a long column, showing how completely the Valley base was surrounded. The Viet Minh hauled heavy guns into the hills and dug trench lines right up to the perimeter. In February 1980, Muhammad Ali meets Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi, bringing global sports fame into a serious government setting with one photo. Ali used trips like this for goodwill and public events across Africa. Korea, 1904. Men pound steamed rice in a wooden mortar to make chewy rice cakes, a process that turns grains into a smooth, stretchy dough through repeated heavy strikes. This was often a group job for holidays and village events because the rhythm mattered. On December 31, 1942, the Di Costanzo family holds its New Year's Eve dinner inside their Mulberry Street restaurant in New York City, with almost no customers that night. The flag and the photo of their son in the Army on the wall. In 1955, photographer Robert Frank captured New Orleans streetcar passengers framed in separate windows, a quiet picture of how everyday rules divided people. It was made only weeks before Rosa Parks's stand in Montgomery. Captured at Clark Airfield in Luzon around January and February 1945, this Nakajima Ki 44 Shoki interceptor shows the tough, compact design Japan used to climb fast and hit bombers. The chipped paint and missing parts are a battlefield autograph. December 19, 1944, near Sauerbrot, Belgium. Staff Sergeant George W. Talbert of the 1st Infantry Division keeps watch in a misty forest, the kind of terrain where sight and sound vanish between the trees. He was from Dubuque, Iowa, and was only 24 years old when he never made it home. New Orleans, 1906. Torpedo boats. USS Porter and USS DuPont are tied to the dock while crowds line up to tour the tiny warships up close. These boats were built for speed and surprise attacks, and seeing them in daylight like this turned cutting-edge naval tech into a waterfront show. In 1866, President Andrew Johnson sits at the center of a crowded banquet during his Swing Around the Circle tour, with Navy Secretary Gideon Welles on one side and General Ulysses S. Grant on the other. The trip was meant to win public support for his Reconstruction plans. This rare image shows President Abraham Lincoln beside Vice President Andrew Johnson at Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4, 1865, just weeks before the White House would change hands. Johnson had already shocked the crowd with an awkward public speech earlier that day. In August 1945, Soviet T-34 tanks crawl over the Greater Khingan Mountains during the invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, pushing armored vehicles through terrain that looks made for hikers, not machines. The silhouettes and smoke show a hard truth of that campaign. Taken in 1951, this photo shows 3 of the last surviving Confederate veterans, men who had been teenagers during the American Civil War and were now living links to the 1860s. Just 5 years later, the last verified Union veteran, Albert Wilson, died in 1956 at 109. Toledo, Ohio, 1944. Women of the Toledo Shipbuilding Company pose at the yard where crews built the icebreaker Mackinac, a Great Lakes workhorse designed to keep shipping lanes open in winter. Many of these women filled skilled roles like welding and riveting while men were away. On December 27, 1900, temperance activist Carrie Nation staged her first famous bar raid at the Carrie Hotel in Wichita, Kansas, wrecking the place to make a national headline. This photo captures the aftermath inside the saloon. In 1991 in Jerusalem, violinist Isaac Stern kept playing during a Gulf War alert, while much of the audience sat wearing protective masks. The photo freezes an unreal contrast of art and emergency, showing how one steady melody can hold a room together. London, 1930. Kids from working-class streets line up in worn boots and caps, turning an ordinary road into a group portrait of the city's youngest workers in training. Many left school early for small jobs like errands and factory work, so this cheerful lineup hides how fast childhood could end in those neighborhoods. This is the Atomium in Brussels during Expo 1958, a futuristic monument shaped like an iron crystal enlarged billions of times. It was meant to stand for only 6 months as a showpiece of new engineering, but it became a permanent national symbol and the most visited site in Belgium. These smiling women in the 1920s show the new flapper style, with short hemlines, loose dresses, and cloche hats that broke old dress rules. After the First World War, mass production and rising wages finally let ordinary people wear looks that once belonged only to the rich. This Berlin street shows the morning after Kristallnacht in November 1938, when shop windows owned by Jewish families were smashed in a coordinated attack. The glittering glass on the ground became a warning sign of how quickly rights, safety. These are the parents of Gavrilo Princip, standing in front of their simple stone house in rural Bosnia in the early 1900s. Their quiet village life feels worlds away from their son's later act in 1914, which set off the chain of events that led to the First World War. These U.S. soldiers are marching through a French town in 1918, only weeks before Germany agreed to end the fighting in the First World War. More than 2 million American troops arrived in Europe that year, giving the exhausted Allied armies fresh strength for their final push. This woman in Thailand in 1955 is using 2 woven baskets to trap fish in a shallow canal, pressing them down so the fish cannot escape. Traditional basket fishing like this has been used across Southeast Asia for centuries, needing more skill and patience than any modern fishing rod. This street in Honolulu's Chinatown is filled with people watching huge clouds of smoke as a fire races through the district in the year 1900. The blaze began as a planned burn to stop an outbreak of disease, but shifting winds burned down much of Chinatown and left thousands of residents suddenly without homes. This American nurse steps out of a trench wearing a gas mask, ready to help wounded soldiers even when the air itself was dangerous. During the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, nurses trained with masks like this because sudden chemical shells could sweep across the trenches without warning. This photo shows engineers in 1958 carefully resetting fallen stones at Stonehenge with cranes and concrete supports. Many visitors think the circle is completely untouched and ancient, but much of what they see today was quietly straightened and rebuilt in the 20th century. Queen Elizabeth II walks past a Russian honor guard during her first and only visit to Russia on 17 October 1994. The trip marked a careful new chapter as a British monarch stood on Russian soil for the first time in history after years of cold relations. This is San Francisco City Hall in April 1906, its grand dome peeled open to show the metal skeleton after the huge earthquake and fires. The ruin was so complete that the city decided to demolish it and start again, turning this wrecked landmark into a symbol of rebuilding. Children's writer Korny Chukovsky is signing the register at Oxford University in 1962 as he receives an honorary doctorate in literature. He was only the third Russian who still lived in Russia to get this title there, after the poet Vasily Zhukovsky and the novelist Ivan Turgenev in the 19th century. This girl in torn clothes at Saratov Station in 1921 is carefully picking up single grains of wheat from the platform. During the Great Hunger after war and crop failure, each grain like this could mean another simple meal for her family. This teenage boy walks through a damaged street in Budapest on 4 November 1956, carrying a rifle as one of the young fighters in the Hungarian uprising. Many students and even schoolboys joined the revolt against Soviet control. This is Khreshchatyk in Kiev in 1944, a main avenue turned into a canyon of ruins after years of occupation, mines, and frontline battles. The few people and carts on the road show how life slowly returned, even while the city center still looked like a stone desert. This 4-year-old boy, Joseph Schleifstein, sits by an aid truck just after soldiers freed him from the Buchenwald prison camp. He became known as the camp's youngest child prisoner, kept alive only because his father hid him in a sack and later passed him off as a tiny worker. These smiling women fighters took part in the freeing of Crimea in 1944, posing together after months of hard life in the hills. Many partisan groups in the region relied on local girls and women as scouts, couriers, and sharpshooters, so the story of resistance here was never only about men. This photo captures film star Charlie Chaplin and independence leader Mahatma Gandhi meeting in London in 1931, an encounter between the world's most famous comedian and one of its most famous peaceful activists. They talked about how modern machines, work, and poverty were changing ordinary lives.